Hear ye. Greetings, my lords and ladies. We heartily welcome thee to an annual Purim Spiel, a humorous retelling of the Booketh of Esther. This year's spiel is fashioned after the writings of the bard himself, William Shakespeare. Thee will findeth bits and pieces of his worketh woven in and throughout our playeth. But thee may say, when to? This is too high class for one as myself. Nay, saith I, 'tis for the ingraft, the common man, sir. Argle, chuckle, shout, and participate in the showeth. Whether thee art here in body, or oneth lineth, join in heartily with boos, ahs, and huzzahs, and spin groggers loudly, whenever Haman is named before thee. Verily, we now present to thee this year's Purim Spiel, Much Ado About Purim.
And gentle ladies, if I might prefer a tale intended not to offend, but to enlighten, a parable to bring about laughter, and also to bringeth about a tear, as if a dream it were, and yet most verily it did occur. To assist our revelries, we require of you, our gentle audience, to join our tale with much shoutings and merriment. When our most excellent cast doth be named, and the sign is held aloft, do shout with all your might their catchphrase. Let us practice as I introduce our players to you now. First, before you, and sometimes afternoon, handsome and bold Sir Mordecai.
Huzzah!
Knight of the realm and upholder of truth, justice, and the American way. The ways of God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. Our good and gentle Lady Esther. Beloved of all, offender to none. Despicable Lord Haman. Would-be destroyer of the Jews. The rest of our cast doth not require special address, but feel free to shout encouragements to them now. The aforementioned villain's wife, Mistress Drash. A shrew not tamed, or too shrewd to be a shrew, only thou can tell. Also, His Most Royal Highness, with friends in low places, the King. Somewhat confused, but always in command. Her Royal Highness brought down to lowness, Queen Vashti.
Whoops. Oh no. Your crown got caught. Hold still. Hold still. Now. Hey! Hey! Yeah! Woo!
Once and former queen to the king. Anon, let us away to flights of fancy as we present Much Ado About Purim.
Huzzah!
Alas, poor Vashti. I knew thee well, a lady of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. Now she is undone. And to think that it was my doing. I punished you for disobeying a foolish order I gave while in my cups. But you had the better of me and acted with prudence. Why you didn't act with Charity, who's a much better actress, I'll never know, but my pride did sting, and I followed churlish advice from my counselors. Oh, my Vashti, my poor, sweet Vashti.
How now, your majesty? What do you hold in your hand?
Go to. Is it Vashti?
Aye, your majesty, 'tis I, one and the same.
Alas! How is it that you are here? I thought you were dead and in the grave.
No, your majesty, merely banished.
But do tell. I am relieved to hear that, but where have you been this whole time?
In a nunnery?
Nunnery? Yes. Well, in a nunnery. Yes. Well, there's only one thing left to say. Get thee to a nunnery. And I must away. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east and Lady Esther. Oh, she is the rising sun. It is my lady. It is my love. Oh, that she knew that she were.
Ah, me.
But see how she leans her hand upon her cheek. Oh, that I were a glove upon that hand, that I may touch that cheek.
O king, Xerxes or Ahasuerus, what's in a name? Your aftershave would smell as sweet. Now that Queen Vashti is no more, I have a chance with you.
And I'll take a chance on you.
What? Who's that?
'Tis I, your one and only true love.
Your Majesty? You can't be caught skulking about in the bushes. If the tabloids get hold of it, they'll make you into a scurvy rent.
'Tis true. Well, parting is such sweet sorrow that I shall say good night till it be morrow. Good night, my sweet fair lady.
Good morrow, gentle sire.
Well, I must away. Lord Haman! My most trusted advisor, canst thou givest me some advice?
Verily, I will.
As you know, Queen Vashti is in a nunnery. She has been banished by my pronouncements. But I regret my pronouncement, and I am lonesome. What advice canst thou givest me?
Your royal, honorable, highly exalted majesty, I suggest you move on and find yourself another wench.
I have, but how do I procure her?
Well, set up a beauteous contest with you as the judge. Then, name the wench you desire as the winner. All know these contests are rigged, and none shall protest.
But I don't want a wench. I want a wife.
As you wish.
Lord Haman! This is most excellent advice that thou hast spoken to me. Verily, all the world's a stage, and the ladies must be players upon it. Therefore, it is a command, and I decree it shall be carried out immediately. I must away.
Sorry, I walked in front again.
Good sirs and gentle ladies, as the king did so order, handsome women from around the kingdom were rounded up and housed in the harem in the citadel of Susa, under the care of Haggai, the king's chief eunuch in charge of the fair ladies. Amongst them was Lady Esther, erstwhile charge of Sir Mordecai.
Huzzah!
Afore she left the household of Sir Mordecai,
Huzzah!
he strictly charged her not to reveal that she was Jewish. A beauteous contest was held, and she was declared the winner and made to be queen. During this time, alas and alack, a despicable plot was hatched to slay the king. It was discovered by none other than Sir Mordecai.
Huzzah!
After he reported it to the king, the jackanapes were quickly dispatched. Though Sir Mordecai was not rewarded until later by the king, his standing grew amongst the peoples. But so also did the standing of Lord Haman. The crafty knave rose to be second in command, and all the peoples did bow and scrape before him and worship him as a god. All the peoples except Sir Mordecai. His God only was the God of Lord Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. This galled Lord Haman to the utmost, and the churl did bamboozle the king to sign an edict to destroy, to slay, and to annihilate all the Jews. While the king and Lord Haman sat down to drink, the city of Susa fell into an uproar. Cut it out!
In the next scene.
Update me on the sitch.
Anon, good lady. I have the goods on that foul Lord Haman. Here is the price paid to the king. And here is that foul edict calling for our destruction. And here's a chicken for our dinner.
And what should I have done with this?
Oh, most assuredly, go speak with the king, and then boil the chicken, make matzo ball soup.
Art thou crazy? I cannot go to the king without being summoned, or I shall be...
Think not that you shall escape up here in the palace. If you hold your peace now, excuse me. If you hold your peace now, be assured that the Jewish people shall be delivered in some other place. However, you can be assured that you and your father's household shall be destroyed. You knowest, of course, that you were born and raised to royalty for such a time as this.
So be it then. Fast for me, and my maids with thee, and we shall see if it will be the end of me.
Mistress Drash, attend to me.
Yes, my lord.
Have a seat. My heart was merry, but now it is downcast. I must tell the tale.
Yes, my lord.
Lady Esther risked her life to come to the king unbidden, and once he raised out the royal scepter, all was forgiven. And for what purpose did she risk her life? Why, to invite the king and I to a royal banquet in her house. Me, Lord Haman, second in command to the king, son of the fifth house, holder of the royal chalice of Rix, heir to the holy rings of Betazed. I skipped home happily like a lamb, and who perchance should I meet? That churl, Sir Mordecai!
Huzzah!
Oh, quiet!
A pox on him.
He refuses to give me my due and bow down and worship me. And now I am down in the dumps.
Fie, restrain his madness, my lord.
Yes, but how?
I knowest how. You should build a gallows just for him. A strapping young gallows 50 cubits high, and ask the king to hang that wretch upon it.
That's it! I shall go anon.
Mayhaps I should not have given him that advice. If Sir Mordecai is a Jew, then no weapon formed against him will prosper. Oh well, what's done is done. No use crying over spilt milk.
How dost thou like them apples, your majesty?
Just fine, my fair lady. But pray thee, do tell, why hast thou invited to this banquet my royal majesticness and this Lord Haman?
May I telleth you later, perhaps on the morrow?
"'Tis the morrow! Do tell, spill the beans, my puppet!"
By your leave, your majesty. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark. I mean, Susa. There is within your kingdom a loutish cutpurse who seeks my death and the death of my people, the Jews.
Nay, nay, thou dost not say.
Yea, yea, I dost say. A foe and an enemy is this foul Lord Haman.
I meant nothing by it. Please save me.
Wilt thou mug the queen in our presence? I sentence thee to death!
Out, out, brief candle. Life is but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury and signifying nothing. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether to be more mortal, to suffer.
Oh, do shut thee up! And I must away with you!
Out, out, foul spot! As this foul Lord Haman was being removed, Harbona tattled on him in regards to the gallows that he had built 50 cubits high. And hence the king ordered that he should be hung thereon, and so also his 10 sons. Although I pleaded with his majesty to revoke that hated edict, it could not be done. But then our wise and brave Sir Mordecai had a storm in the brain. The king, his royal majestic nobleness, had given his royal signet ring to Sir Mordecai. He crafted another edict, giving permission to the Jews to slay, to destroy, and to annihilate all those who sought to slay them. Doing. Oh, okay, give you a chance? Whoops. This is the girl who taught me how to do this. And so the Jews assembled to fight all of those who sought their harm. And the Jews overcame all those who sought to slay them. The city of Susa rejoiced. And there was feasting, and there was joy, and there was gladness, and a holiday. And many of the peoples of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. Good lords and gentle ladies, attend my voice. Although the name of the God of myself and Sir Mordecai is not named in my book which retells these events, verily so, his deeds are seen in all the proceedings therewith. Therefore, let me leave you with this word upon your ear. There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio. Ladies, we thank you for your kind attention and gentle warmth. However, there is one person up here that you have not seen. And so we call to your attention the scribe who did scribble our lines and the director who did direct our steps for your merriment. We give you Ms. Rosemary Pankin.
My cast and all those behind the scenes that you did not see. I would also like to ask parents, please confiscate all those mini rubber chickens. Thank you so much.
Just when we thought the world was getting over COVID and things looked like they were going to be opening up shortly, we find ourselves faced with the revival of the threat of the Cold War. Now, many of you are probably too young to remember what the Cold War was like, but for people of my generation, the threat of nuclear annihilation was very real. And it was so real that we were trained to hide under our desks in school in the case of a nuclear attack. Yeah, right, exactly. Even back then, even in first, second, third grade, we knew, well, living in Manhattan at ground zero, it was pretty much the promise of instant vaporization. So, but, just as we felt like the Cold War was beginning to thaw, then we have Russia's resurgence and their invasion of Ukraine, and Putin trying to keep NATO and particularly the United States from getting involved in the battle is, of course, threatening the use of nuclear weapons if we should do that. And it's just a great reminder of the tenuousness of life. It really is tenuous because even if we're not concerned about things like nuclear war or nuclear weaponry, there's a lot in life that is very scary, right? Very, very scary. And we think about people we know who we've heard of just recently who have been diagnosed with serious life-threatening illnesses. We're painfully aware of the fact that anytime we get into our car, we may encounter a collision that we were not anticipating and certainly not looking for. And life is hard, and we find ourselves in difficult circumstances over and over again. And I just want us to think about that for a minute as we think just very quickly and briefly about one of the themes of the book of Esther and the story of Esther. And I want us to ask ourselves the question, well, what lesson can we take from our celebration of Purim today? So what does Purim, what can Purim teach us in the face of existential threats, that is, threats to our very lives? What can it teach us today? And I want us to see that in a very basic way, one of the messages of the book of Esther, just in the way it's written, is that confidence in God really is the only foundation for real courage, Because if you stop and you think about it, both Mordecai and Esther really stepped up and stepped out in ways that when I read the story and I read the text, I really question whether I would have done the same thing. And so that's what I want to reflect on just a little bit this morning. I'm just going to share quickly about a little bit of the background of the book of Esther. It takes place after the return from captivity of the Babylonian captivity. The first exiles returned under Ezra and Nehemiah in about 538 BCE, and Esther takes place about 55 years after that. And so the Jewish people who were living in Susa and in Ahasuerus' kingdom are living there by choice. They could have gone back to the land. In fact, God had instructed Ezra and Nehemiah and others to go back to the land, to rebuild the temple, etc., etc. And yet our people chose, many of our people, most of our people, in fact, chose to stay in exile. Just, they'd been living there 50, 60 years. They had homes, they had businesses, and, why not? And so it's taking place. And so our people in this story are, I think, as the crow flies, about 800 miles from Jerusalem, and as people walk, at least 1,000 miles from Jerusalem, because no one could fly a crow back then, and they didn't have planes. So the people, so Purim deals with God's people as a minority amongst a huge and an often hostile nation around them. And it's a familiar story. We've seen it played out generation after generation in one land or another in reference to our people's exile and being spread throughout the earth. But the story of Purim, in a very creative way, teaches us about God's faithfulness. And the reason I say it's a creative way is because it is God's name, of course. One of the unique things about the book of Esther is that God's name is nowhere mentioned in it. And not only is God or Lord mentioned in it, but nobody even prays to God or the Lord in an outright way, in his name or by his name, or makes a request of him. We don't see a prophet anywhere in the book who comes alongside of Esther and Mordecai and says, "Thus saith the Lord, this is what the Lordeth wanteth youeth to doeth." And so you don't see any of that stuff in there, and yet Purim features God's faithfulness in several different ways. And one of the ways it does that is by punishing, by destroying the household of Haman. Because what's interesting is that Haman is from the line of Amalek, And in 3:1, it's very interesting to note that Haman's lineage is the only one given in the book besides Mordecai and Esther. And so again, it's a literary way of the author of the book. We don't know who wrote the book, but it is a literary way of the author of the book to say that's important. Who this man is, where he came from, is important. And so it turns out that he is an Agagite. He is a descendant of Agag, the king of Amalek. And there's an ancient animosity between Israel and Amalek. And we read about it initially in Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 and following, where Amalek attacks Israel after the Exodus. And then in the book, it says in Exodus 17, verses 14 to 16, he says, "I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." I will utterly blot out his memory. And then we read later in the Bible, we read that Samuel in 1 Samuel 15:9, we'll be talking about this in our study of 1 Samuel, but Saul disobeys this order and does not wipe them out. And as a result, Haman is alive to seek to destroy our people in Esther's time. And God's faithfulness is seen in Esther chapter 7, verse 10, where Haman is hanged. And not only is he hanged, and by the way, this is a little gross, but it wasn't like he was hanged to death. He was beheaded, probably, and his dead body was hanged on the gallows that he had built. That's how they used gallows back then. They didn't use them to hang people to death. And so he was put up on the gallows that he built for Mordecai, but not only was Haman killed, his 10 sons were killed. And the reason the text makes a point of telling us their names and that they were killed is so that we understand his name, his progeny, his line was wiped out according to God's promise. And did you know that this is the reason why we stomp our feet every time his name is mentioned during the Purim Spiel or the reading of the scroll of Esther. In fact, in the Orthodox community, many people will write the name Haman on the bottom of their shoe with chalk, so that by the end of the reading of the book of Esther, the Megillah Esther, his name has been wiped out, has been blotted out and removed. And so we see God's faithfulness to his promises literally hundreds of years later. And so we also see Purim also features God's faithfulness in preserving God's people, not only punishing Haman, but in preserving God's people. And we can't read and understand Esther apart from God's promises. It just doesn't make any sense. And one of the things I love about the book is that that the author puts in the mouths the truths that really drive the story forward in the book of Esther. And so it's when Haman's wife says to him, if Mordecai is of the people of the Jews, you cannot defeat him. You cannot defeat him. And so that's a picture, if you will, and a summation of the reality of God's promise to Abraham. God's promise to Abraham. And so you can't understand the book of Esther apart from God's promise to preserve for himself a people in all history. We see the promise reflected in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. We see it in God's promise to David about his house and his kingdom enduring forever. We read about that in 2 Samuel chapter 7. We read the same theme of promise of the endurance of God's people, our Jewish people, in Psalm 89, verses 30 to 37. And in that text, God says he promises to keep his promise. He will keep his promise despite our sin and our rebellion, which is totally amazing, but totally consistent with the nature of the promise God made to Abraham. And of course, one of my favorite places is Jeremiah 31, verses 35 to 37. God says, look, as long as the sun and the moon and the cosmos are together, then you will endure before me as a people. That's a pretty good promise. And so Esther is built on God's promise of preservation for his people. And then in Esther chapter 5, verse 4, it's a hinge verse because it marks the beginning of the preservation. It marks the beginning of a reversal. So you see in Esther chapter 5, verse 4, it says, I'm sorry, let me get my copy of my slide so I can actually see what I'm looking at. Okay, it says, if it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come out this day to the banquet that I have prepared for him. And when you look at this, now I'm going to explain something I've explained before. I've mentioned this a number of years, and I just want to preface what I'm going to say by saying this is somewhat controversial. I'm personally convinced this is real and this was done on purpose. But it doesn't have to be the case in order for the book to make sense. But what I'm going to show you, I'm showing you only to highlight the importance of this verse, because chapter 5, verse 4, it's a hinge verse because it begins the reversal of all of the circumstances. The book is one of the literary techniques that the author uses in the book is reversal. It was this way, and then boom, now all of a sudden it's this way. Haman was on top, now Haman's dead, Mordecai is on top, etc., etc. And so this is the beginning of that in this verse. And so if we get the next slide, this is the Hebrew of that verse, and I won't try to read it for you, but what I want to point out is that arrow indicates that if you read the first letter of those 4 words in the verse, in the Hebrew verse, the first letter of each of those 4 words spell out Yud-He Vav-He, meaning the ineffable name of God, what sometimes is translated probably incorrectly as Yahweh. and it means the Lord. We read about it, next slide, we read about it in our scriptures as Lord, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, referring to the ineffable name of God. And so it's important for us to understand that it is God himself who is behind these things. And it brings to mind a verse from Proverbs, let's see. No, wait, I skipped over a whole section here. So Esther 5:4 is a hinge verse. It marks the beginning of our preservation from destruction by Haman. And so in 7 verse 7 and following, Haman is hanged. In 8:1 and following, Mordecai is exalted. In 9:1 and following, the Jewish people eliminate their enemies throughout the kingdom. In 9:20 verses 28, Purim becomes an obligation for all future generations of Jews. And it just reminds us that God, although often, in my notes here it says, although sometimes silent, and I want to say no, often silent. We don't have a word from the Lord in this day. We don't have a prophetic word, somebody coming to speak. He speaks clearly through his written word, no doubt. But it reminds us that when God, even though God is silent, he is always faithful. He is always faithful. And so I just want to remind you that that's what's true. So whatever it is, what's going on in your life today? What are the challenges you're facing? Some people are really anxious and nervous about what's going on in Europe because of the implications for the entire world. Others of us are struggling with more personal issues at home, family issues, work issues, and things like that. And we are struggling to make a stand and to walk with the Lord in faith and confidence. And where that confidence comes from is from understanding the faithfulness of God. He will never leave us or forsake us. That every promise he has made to us will come to pass. That even when we fall and we fail in our sin, if we have put our trust in the finished work of Messiah, his atoning sacrifice for us, we will be received by God. We will get to enjoy his presence forever. We will be redeemed. We will get new bodies, and we will get to live with him in a new Eden, if you will. Forever. God is faithful. God is working today in your life. He causes all things to work together for the good to those who love him and those who call him according to his purpose. And so when we see the threat to ourselves and we are struggling to act courageously in the midst of our trials, the key to that is understanding and remembering and seeing God's faithfulness. And we see it portrayed for us in a wonderful way in our story of Esther. And so I just want to finish with this. I just want to see. So it's seeing God's faithfulness is so important. But how does that activate in our lives? And this is what I want to point out. Haman trusted in himself. Haman had faith in what he could see and what he knew. He had his own system of morality. He trusted his proximity to the king, his connections. He trusted his wealth. He trusted his religious system, and we don't think about it that way, but the casting of lots, Purim, which means lots, was a word that it was cast or thrown, and it was a way of finding out the will of the stars or the cosmos, as you will. And he was depending on all of these things. Haman, what? Had faith in what? What was Haman's faith in? Haman's faith was in himself, wasn't it? And we see where he ended up as a result of trusting in himself. And then we see, in contrast to Haman, we see Mordecai and Esther who trusted in God. And we don't hear them speaking of God, but the text makes it clear that he is there in their thinking, in their consciousness. It's hinted at in the book by Mordecai in chapter 3, verses 2 through 4, where Mordecai refuses to bow down, right, before Haman. and all of the other people who were gathered at the gate, all of the ministers who were gathered at the gate, for several days, we don't know how many days, kept saying to to Mordecai, you need to bow down. Why aren't you bowing down? Everybody else is bowing down. You're going to pay an awful price. You need to bow down day after day after day after day. And what did Mordecai tell them as a reason he could not bow down? The text says this. It says after they asked the question, why are you transgressing the king's command? It says now it was when they had spoken daily to Mordecai, and he would not listen to them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand. For Mordecai, had told them that he was a Jew. All right, so it's not just a nationalistic thing. It's not just, well, I'm a Jew. No, it's, I'm a Jew. I am Jewish. I am a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he alone is God, and he alone is to be bowed before and be worshiped, and no man is to be put in his place. And so Mordecai clearly has God in his thinking as he makes his bold stand. And then again, it's hinted at in chapter 4, verse 13, in Mordecai's words to Esther, where he says, deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. And Mordecai is clearly thinking of the providence and the sovereignty of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it has emboldened him to take a stand where his life literally was at risk. And we see it hinted at as well in the life of Esther. In chapter 4, verse 16, she says, what's her response when Mordecai challenges her to go to the king? Her response is, it can get me killed. But then when he comes back at her, she finally agrees. And what is her response? What is her request of Mordecai? Fast for me as I and my maids fast before I go into the king. Well, people fast as a way of communicating to themselves and demonstrating before God their abject dependence on him. And so clearly Esther had God in her thinking as she stepped up and acted with such boldness and bravery. I mean, it's just hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine a woman doing that in a male-dominated society. But it's even harder to imagine it in a society where women had no value, or practically no value, apart from the men in their lives. And so she showed just an amazing, amazing amount of confidence and boldness as a result. And so so the question is, so understanding and seeing God's faithfulness to his promises, how does that get activated in our lives? And it gets activated by faith. It gets activated by faith in him, by seeing who he is, by taking in who he is, and then choosing in faith to rely on who he is and his faithfulness to his promises, even if it kills us. Even if it doesn't produce the result that we want, even if it leads to suffering. And why is the suffering worth it? It's not enjoyable, but it's worth it because God is faithful to his promises, and he will keep every one of them to us. And so whatever it is in your life today, perhaps you're thinking about your relationship with God and you're really struggling with coming to faith in Messiah Jesus and believing that he's the promised Messiah and putting your trust in him, especially if you came from a background like I did, where like, no, you don't do that. We don't do that. We Jews don't do that. And you're really struggling with that. I just want to encourage you and challenge you to consider the faithfulness of God. And let that give you the boldness and the courage and the bravery, if you will, to go with what's true, to do what the Scriptures invite you to do, and to turn from whatever it is you're trusting in, and to put your trust in Messiah alone for the forgiveness of your sins. And God will meet you, and he will be faithful to that promise. And for those of us who have already come to that place in our lives, life doesn't become just a Cheriboles at that point, does it? Life continues to be hard, and there are aspects of life that become even harder when we're walking with the Lord. So wherever it is, if you need courage, if you need bravery, it's found in reflecting on God's faithfulness to all of his promises, to you included. Amen? Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for this amazing story of the book of Esther. Thank you that it's told with this tongue-in-cheek, almost, a comic irreverence, because it shows, Lord, that all human attempt to escape you and to escape your will and your purposes is a joke. And so help us to take that to heart, Lord. Help us to take that to heart personally. Help us to learn from Esther and Mordecai. Help us to see your faithfulness even when you're silent. And Lord, to in faith step out into your faithfulness, and in that find the boldness, the courage that we need to walk with you. We lift ourselves to you for blessing. We thank you again in Yeshua's name. Amen.
Amen.